The kitchen was silent, save for the faint sizzle of a stew simmering on the stove. In the dim glow of a single bulb, a woman stood alone, her hands trembling as she stirred the pot. Her eyes, once warm with the promise of a hearty meal, now burned with a secret so dark it seemed to choke the air around her. The year was 1992, and in a quiet Virginia town, the wealthy Hawthorne family eagerly awaited their dinner, unaware that the woman they called their cook, Eleanor, a descendant of enslaved people who had toiled on their ancestral land, had laced their meal with something far deadlier than spice. Each stir of her spoon was a calculated act, a silent rebellion against decades of whispered cruelties and buried injustices. By morning, the Hawthornes would be dead, and Eleanor would be gone, leaving behind a trail of questions that would haunt the town for years. What drove a woman, known for her gentle demeanor and culinary skill, to commit such a chilling act? Was it revenge for a past too painful to bear, or something even more unsettling? A fracture in her mind that no one saw coming? This is no ordinary tale of crime. It's a descent into the shadows of the human psyche, where the line between victim and villain blurs into something unrecognizable. What you're about to hear will pull you into a world where trust is a poison, and the truth is more disturbing than any fiction. Could a single meal carry the weight of centuries of suffering? And what does it reveal about the fragility of the human mind when pushed to its breaking point? This story, rooted in the chilling echoes of the American Monsters series, will unravel a psychiatric case that defies explanation. It's a journey into a hidden truth that few have dared to face, a truth that might make you question how well you know the people around you or even yourself. Will you stay until the end to uncover the secret that Eleanor carried to her grave? The answers lie in the darkness, and they're not what you expect. Let's connect in this moment of suspense. If you're ready to dive into this haunting tale, hit that like button to ensure more people uncover the chilling reality behind cases like Eleanor's. In the comments, write, "I'm ready to discover the truth about this story." By doing so, you're joining a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid to confront the mysteries that lurk in the corners of the human mind. Thank you for being here, for daring to look where others turn away. Prepare yourself, because what comes next contains a key revelation that will forever change the way you see the human mind. The Hawthorne estate stood like a relic of a bygone era, its sprawling lawns and ivy-covered walls a testament to old money and older secrets. In the spring of 1992, the town of Willow Creek, Virginia, buzzed with quiet admiration for the family who lived there. The Hawthornes were pillars of the community, philanthropists, churchgoers, and hosts of lavish gatherings that drew the town's elite. Their mansion, built in the 1800s on land once worked by enslaved people, was a symbol of their enduring legacy. But beneath the polished surface, something simmered, unnoticed by the guests who sipped wine in the chandelier-lit dining room. That something was Eleanor Grayson, the cook who moved through the house like a shadow, her presence so unassuming that few ever thought to question it. Eleanor was 52, her face etched with lines that spoke of a life harder than most could imagine. She had worked for the Hawthornes for nearly a decade, hired after their previous cook retired. To the family, she was a godsend. Her meals were exquisite, her demeanor polite, her loyalty unquestioned. She lived in a small cottage on the edge of the estate, a perk of her employment, and rarely spoke of her life beyond the kitchen. The Hawthornes, patriarch William, his wife Margaret, and their two adult children, Clara and Thomas, praised her cooking at every turn. Eleanor's gumbo could raise the dead, William would chuckle, unaware of the irony his words would soon carry. But Eleanor was more than a cook. She was a woman carrying the weight of history. Her great-grandmother had been enslaved on the very land where the Hawthorne mansion now stood, her labor feeding the family's ancestors while her own children went hungry. Eleanor had grown up hearing stories of that time, stories of cruelty, of stolen lives, of promises broken. Her mother had warned her to keep those stories buried, to move forward, to survive. But survival, Eleanor found, was not the same as living. Each day in the Hawthorne kitchen, as she chopped vegetables and seasoned roasts, she felt the ghosts of her ancestors watching her, their whispers growing louder with every passing year. The townsfolk knew little of Eleanor's inner world. To them, she was a quiet, church-going woman who kept to herself. But there were signs, small, easily missed, that something was shifting. The local grocer noticed Eleanor buying unusual herbs, ones not typically used in Southern cooking, and remarked on it in passing. A neighbor once saw her standing motionless in her cottage garden at midnight, staring at the stars as if waiting for a sign. And Clara Hawthorne, the younger daughter, had once overheard Eleanor muttering to herself in the kitchen, words that sounded like a prayer but carried an edge of venom. "They'll pay," Clara thought she heard, but dismissed it as a trick of her imagination. Eleanor was loyal after all, she was family. Yet, in the spring of 1992, Eleanor's behavior began to change in ways that were harder to ignore. She grew distant, her eyes often fixed on some unseen point as she worked. She started keeping a small notebook, its pages filled with cryptic notes and sketches no one was allowed to see. When Margaret Hawthorne asked her to prepare a special dinner for an upcoming charity gala, Eleanor agreed with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The menu she proposed was elaborate, a 5-course meal featuring dishes that seemed to draw from traditions older than the town itself. A taste of history, she called it, and the Hawthornes, charmed by the idea, gave her free rein. What no one knew was that Eleanor had been planning this dinner for months. Her notebook, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her cottage, contained more than recipes. It held a meticulous record of the Hawthornes' habits, their routines, their weaknesses. She had studied them, not out of devotion but with the precision of a predator. The herbs she bought weren't just for flavor. They were part of a recipe far older and darker, one she had learned from a distant relative who spoke of old ways for settling scores. Eleanor wasn't just cooking for the Hawthornes, she was crafting their undoing. As the gala approached, the mansion buzzed with preparations. Invitations went out to Willow Creek's elite, promising an evening of elegance and generosity. Eleanor worked tirelessly, her hands steady as she ground herbs into fine powders and stirred pots with a rhythm that felt almost ritualistic. The night of the gala, the dining room would be filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the aroma of Eleanor's cooking. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, one that would leave the town reeling and Eleanor's name whispered in fear for years to come. The evening of the charity gala arrived on a warm May night in 1992, and the Hawthorne mansion glowed like a beacon against the darkening Virginia sky. Lanterns lined the cobblestone path to the entrance, casting flickering shadows on the faces of Willow Creek's elite as they arrived in their finest attire. Inside, the dining room was a vision of opulence. Crystal chandeliers sparkled, long tables were draped in white linen, and the air hummed with anticipation. The Hawthornes, dressed in tailored suits and elegant gowns, mingled with their guests, their smiles practiced and warm. William Hawthorne raised a glass to toast the evening's cause, a new community center for the town, while Margaret beamed at his side, her pride in their family's legacy palpable. Clara and Thomas, their children, charmed the crowd with witty banter, unaware that the true orchestrator of the night stood quietly in the kitchen, her hands steady as she plated the first course. Eleanor moved through the bustling kitchen with a grace that belied the weight of her intentions. Her staff, 2 young assistants hired for the event, followed her lead, unaware of the significance of the powder she sprinkled into the dishes or the strange, rhythmic chants she whispered under her breath as she worked. The menu was a masterpiece, a chilled cucumber soup to start, followed by braised quail with a mysterious herb glaze, a root vegetable medley steeped in an unfamiliar spice, and a main course of slow-cooked lamb in a sauce that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural depth. For dessert, a dark berry tart, its crust dusted with a powder so fine it was nearly invisible. The guests, accustomed to Eleanor's culinary brilliance, would later remark that the meal felt almost otherworldly, each bite carrying a flavor they couldn't quite place. As the first course was served, Eleanor stood at the kitchen doorway, watching the guests sip their soup. Her face was a mask of calm, but her heart pounded with a mixture of dread and resolve. She had spent months perfecting the dosages, consulting her notebook's cryptic entries and testing her concoctions in secret. The herbs she used weren't random. They were drawn from a tradition passed down through generations of her family, a blend of folklore and pharmacology that promised a slow, undetectable end. The powders, derived from plants long forgotten by modern medicine, were odorless, tasteless, and lethal in the right combination. Eleanor had calculated everything: the timing, the servings, the way the toxins would linger in the body, silent until it was too late. The dining room buzzed with conversation as the meal progressed. William Hawthorne, red-faced from wine and laughter, complimented Eleanor publicly, calling her the heart of our home. Margaret nodded, her eyes misty with gratitude, while Clara, ever observant, noticed a strange aftertaste in the quail, but dismissed it as her imagination. Thomas, less discerning, ate heartily, joking about needing seconds. The guests, unaware of the danger, savored each course, their compliments echoing through the room. But as the night wore on, a subtle unease began to creep in. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces flushed. One woman excused herself, citing a sudden headache. Another man loosened his tie, complaining of a strange warmth. Eleanor, back in the kitchen, watched the clock. She knew the symptoms would come slowly. Dizziness, a racing pulse, a creeping lethargy that would feel like exhaustion at first. She had planned it this way, ensuring no one would suspect the meal until the gala was over and the guests had dispersed. Her assistants, unaware of her actions, were sent home early, leaving Eleanor alone to clean the kitchen. As she scrubbed the pots, her movements were deliberate, almost reverent. She felt the weight of her ancestors' eyes upon her, their approval a faint hum in her mind. This wasn't just about the Hawthorns. It was about the land, the history, the pain that had soaked into the soil beneath their feet. Outside, the gala continued, the music swelling as the dessert tarts were served. The guests, now deep in their cups, laughed and danced, oblivious to the ticking clock within their bodies. Eleanor slipped out of the kitchen, her apron discarded, and stood in the garden behind her cottage. The night was quiet, the stars above indifferent. She clutched her notebook, its pages worn from constant handling, and whispered a final prayer, not for forgiveness, but for strength. The gala would end in triumph for the Hawthorns, but by dawn the mansion would be a tomb, and Eleanor's secret would be buried with them. The first light of dawn crept over Willow Creek on that fateful May morning in 1992, painting the Hawthorne estate in soft hues of pink and gold that belied the horror unfolding within its walls. The mansion, so alive with music and laughter just hours before, now stood eerily silent, its grandeur mocking the stillness inside. The gala had ended around midnight, with guests departing in a haze of contentment, their bellies full and their minds buzzing from wine and conversation. No one noticed anything amiss. Perhaps a slight fatigue here, a mild discomfort there, but nothing to raise alarms. The Hawthorns had bid their farewells at the door, William's handshakes firm, Margaret's hugs warm, Clara and Thomas lingering with friends. By 1 a.m., the family had retired to their rooms, the house settling into its usual nighttime quiet. Eleanor, having finished her cleanup, had slipped back to her cottage, where she sat by the window watching the mansion's lights flicker off one by one. The discovery began innocently enough. At 7 a.m., the Hawthorns' housekeeper, Mrs. Lydia Barnes, arrived as she did every morning, her key turning in the lock with a familiar click. She expected the usual scene. The faint aroma of last night's feast lingering, perhaps a few stray glasses to collect. Instead, she was met with an unnatural hush. Calling out for Margaret, she received no answer. Venturing upstairs, her footsteps echoing on the polished wood floors, Lydia first checked the master bedroom. There she found William and Margaret still in bed, their faces pale, eyes open but unseeing. A gasp escaped her lips as she approached, her hand trembling as she touched Margaret's cold skin. Panic rising, she rushed to Clara's room, then Thomas's, finding them in similar states, motionless, as if frozen in sleep. The air felt heavy, charged with an invisible dread that made Lydia's heart race. She fled downstairs, her mind reeling, and dialed the emergency line from the kitchen phone, her voice breaking as she reported what she had seen. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek, a town unaccustomed to such tragedy. By 8 a.m., police cars lined the driveway, their lights flashing silently in the morning sun. Sheriff Harlan Reed, a veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor, took charge, cordoning off the estate and directing his deputies to secure the scene. Paramedics confirmed what Lydia had feared. The entire Hawthorne family was dead, with no immediate signs of foul play. The bodies showed no wounds, no marks, just a peaceful repose that seemed almost too serene. Whispers began among the responders. Heart attacks? A gas leak? But the air was clear, and the family had been in good health. As investigators combed the mansion, they noted the remnants of the gala. Half-empty wine glasses, dessert plates with crumbs of Eleanor's tart. Samples were collected, but suspicion hadn't yet turned to the food. Eleanor, meanwhile, maintained her routine. She emerged from her cottage at her usual time, apron tied, ready to prepare breakfast, though today there would be none. When questioned by deputies, she expressed shock, her eyes wide with feigned surprise. "They were fine last night," she said softly, her voice steady. The gala was a success. She cooperated fully, describing the menu in detail, omitting nothing, or so it seemed. Her notebook remained hidden, its secrets safe for now. The town, gathering at the estate's gates, buzzed with speculation. The Hawthorns were beloved. Their sudden loss sent ripples of grief through the community. Friends recalled the evening's joy, puzzled by the turn of events. "It doesn't make sense," one guest murmured to another. "We all ate the same meal." As the day wore on, autopsies were prioritized, the bodies transported under a veil of secrecy. Toxicologists were called in, their initial tests revealing traces of unusual compounds, alkaloids from rare plants, metabolites that hinted at poisoning. But the source? The food, perhaps, but how? Attention shifted to Eleanor, the one who had prepared it all. Deputies searched her cottage, finding nothing out of the ordinary at first. It was only when a loose floorboard creaked underfoot that they discovered the notebook. Its pages, filled with recipes intertwined with historical grievances, raised eyebrows. Entries spoke of justice for the past, of herbs that balanced the scales. Eleanor was taken in for questioning, her calm demeanor cracking ever so slightly under the sheriff's gaze. The interrogation room at the Willow Creek station was stark, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows. Sheriff Reed sat across from Eleanor, his notebook open. "Tell me about your family history," he began, sensing there was more to this quiet woman. Eleanor hesitated, then spoke of her ancestors, the enslaved people who had built the Hawthorne fortune. Her words were measured, revealing a deep-seated pain that had festered over years. "They never acknowledged it," she said quietly. "The land remembers, even if people forget." Reed pressed on, piecing together a motive rooted in legacy and loss. Eleanor's responses hinted at a mind shaped by trauma, one where reality and retribution blurred. By evening, the town was in mourning, candlelight vigils forming outside the church. Guests from the gala reported mild symptoms, headaches, nausea, that faded quickly, suggesting the full dose had been reserved for the family. Eleanor's arrest came quietly, her hands cuffed as she was led away. The notebook became key evidence, its contents a window into a psyche driven by historical echoes. Psychiatrists were consulted, their evaluations painting a picture of a woman whose mind had turned inward, crafting a narrative of vengeance from the threads of her heritage. The case, once a mystery, now unfolded as a tragic intersection of past and present, leaving Willow Creek to grapple with its own hidden histories. The fluorescent lights of the Willow Creek police station buzzed faintly as Eleanor sat in the interrogation room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. It was the afternoon of May 7th, 1992, and the town outside was still reeling from the deaths of the Hawthorne family. Sheriff Harlan Reed, his face etched with the strain of a case unlike any he'd seen, studied Eleanor closely. Her calm demeanor unnerved him, not the panicked denial of a guilty party but a quiet resolve, as if she had been preparing for this moment. The notebook, now in an evidence bag on the table, held the key to understanding her actions, but its cryptic entries only deepened the mystery. Pages filled with recipes were interspersed with references to debts unpaid and the blood of the land. To Reed, it was a puzzle. To Eleanor, it was a manifesto. Eleanor's story began to unravel under questioning, not through confessions of guilt but through glimpses into her past. She spoke of her childhood in Willow Creek, growing up in a small house just beyond the town's edges, where her mother and grandmother had filled her head with stories of their ancestors. They were tales of survival, of women who toiled under the whip on the Hawthorne plantation, their names erased from the family's proud history. Eleanor's great-grandmother, Bessie, had been a cook, just like her, preparing meals for the Hawthorne's ancestors while her own children scavenged for scraps. "The land remembers," Eleanor repeated, her voice soft but unwavering. "It holds every tear, every scream." Reed, a practical man, struggled to connect these historical grievances to the deaths of 4 people in 1992. He pressed her about the herbs, the powders, the strange rituals hinted at in her notebook. Eleanor admitted to using plants from her garden, foxglove, nightshade, others she called by names long forgotten, but claimed they were for flavor, not harm. "I wanted the meal to tell a story," she said, her eyes distant, a story they'd never tasted before. When asked about the gala guests who reported mild symptoms, she shrugged, insisting she'd served the same food to everyone. But the toxicologist's reports, now trickling in, told a different tale. The Hawthorns' bodies contained lethal doses of cardiac glycosides, compounds that could stop a heart without leaving a trace of violence. As the interrogation stretched into hours, a psychiatrist, Dr. Evelyn Carter, was brought in to evaluate Eleanor. A specialist in trauma-related disorders, Carter sat quietly, observing Eleanor's measured responses. She noted the way Eleanor spoke of the past as if it were alive, as if the injustices of the 1800s were unfolding in the present. Her sense of time seems collapsed. Carter later wrote in her report, "The trauma of her ancestors appears to have fused with her own experiences, creating a narrative where retribution feels not just justified, but inevitable." Eleanor described dreams where she saw her great-grandmother Bessie, urging her to set things right. These visions, Carter suggested, might indicate a dissociative state, where Eleanor's identity blurred with the collective pain of her lineage. Outside the station, Willow Creek was fracturing. News of Eleanor's arrest spread like wildfire, and the town's residents grappled with conflicting emotions. Some saw her as a monster, a woman who had betrayed the trust of a beloved family. Others, particularly those from the Black community, whispered about the Hawthorns' less savory history, rumors of land disputes of families displaced when the estate expanded decades ago. Older residents recalled stories of the plantation days, passed down through generations, and wondered if Eleanor's actions were less about madness and more about a reckoning. The local church, where Eleanor had been a regular, became a battleground for debates. Was she a victim of her own mind or a vigilante for a forgotten past? The police continued their investigation, digging deeper into Eleanor's life. They interviewed neighbors, who described her as solitary but kind, often seen tending her garden or reading in her cottage. A librarian recalled Eleanor borrowing books on herbalism and folklore, her interest growing in the months leading up to the gala. A cousin living in a nearby town spoke of Eleanor's obsession with family history, how she'd spent hours tracing their lineage back to the plantation. "She said the Hawthorns owed us," the cousin admitted, her voice heavy with regret. "I thought she meant an apology, not this." By evening, the evidence was mounting. The notebook's entries, paired with lab results, pointed to premeditation. Eleanor had sourced her poisons carefully, cultivating plants in her garden that were both beautiful and deadly. She had tested her mixtures, the notebook revealing trial runs on small animals, a fact that chilled investigators. Yet Eleanor maintained an eerie calm, never admitting guilt but never denying it either. "The land demanded balance," she said at one point, her voice almost a whisper. To Dr. Carter, this was a sign of a mind fractured by historical trauma, where justice and vengeance had become indistinguishable. To Reed, it was the confession of a calculated killer. As night fell, the station grew quiet, but the weight of Eleanor's words lingered. The investigation was far from over, and the town was left to wrestle with a question that gnawed at its core. Was Eleanor a woman driven mad by the ghosts of the past? Or had she, in her own way, served a justice that history had denied? The answer lay buried in her mind, and the key to unlocking it was still out of reach. By late May 1992, Willow Creek had become a town divided, its streets humming with whispers and its homes filled with unease. Eleanor Grayson's arrest had ignited a firestorm of speculation, and as her trial loomed, the once quiet community found itself under a national spotlight. Reporters descended on the small Virginia courthouse, their cameras flashing as they documented the case dubbed the Slave Cook's Revenge by a sensationalist headline. The name stuck, painting Eleanor as both a tragic figure and a calculating villain. The Hawthorn estate, now sealed off and guarded, stood as a silent witness to the tragedy, its windows dark, its grandeur tainted. Inside the courtroom, Eleanor sat composed, her eyes fixed on some distant point as the prosecution began to weave a narrative of cold-blooded murder. The prosecutor, a sharp-tongued attorney named Daniel Hargrove, opened with a chilling depiction of the gala night. He described Eleanor's meticulous planning, her use of rare, toxic plants, and the deliberate targeting of the Hawthorn family. "This was not a crime of passion," Hargrove declared, holding up Eleanor's notebook for the jury to see. "This was a calculated act of vengeance disguised as a meal." He detailed the toxicology reports, the lethal combination of foxglove and nightshade derivatives that had stopped the Hawthorns' hearts within hours. The gala guests, who had consumed smaller doses, suffered only mild symptoms, a fact Hargrove used to argue Eleanor's precision. "She spared the innocent," he said, but condemned the family she blamed for her pain. Eleanor's defense attorney, Sarah Whitaker, a public defender with a reputation for tenacity, took a different approach. She painted Eleanor as a woman broken by the weight of history, her actions the result of a mind unraveled by trauma. Whitaker called Dr. Evelyn Carter to the stand, who testified about Eleanor's psychological state. Ms. Grayson exhibits signs of complex post-traumatic stress, Carter explained. Her fixation on her ancestors' suffering suggests a dissociative response, where she felt compelled to act as an agent of their justice. Carter described Eleanor's vivid dreams, her belief that her great-grandmother's spirit guided her, and her inability to separate past from present. The courtroom grew quiet as Carter spoke of intergenerational trauma, a concept unfamiliar to many but resonant in a town built on plantation land. The prosecution countered with evidence of premeditation. They presented Eleanor's notebook, its pages a chilling blend of recipes and retribution. One entry, dated weeks before the gala, read, "The stew will carry their sins back to them." Another sketched a layout of the Hawthorne dining room, with notes on each family member's habits. William's love of rich sauces, Margaret's preference for small portions, Clara's sweet tooth. The notebook also contained references to rituals, phrases in a dialect no one could fully translate, hinting at a spiritual dimension to Eleanor's actions. A botanist testified about the plants in her garden, confirming their toxicity and rarity. "These aren't herbs you stumble upon," he said. She sought them out, cultivated them with care. Witnesses painted a complex picture. The grocer recalled Eleanor's purchases of obscure seeds, her questions about their properties veiled as culinary curiosity. A neighbor testified to seeing Eleanor burn papers in her garden the night after the gala, her face illuminated by the flames. Clara's friend, who had attended the gala, recounted the strange aftertaste of the meal, a detail she hadn't thought significant until now. Yet others spoke in Eleanor's defense. A pastor from her church described her as a woman of faith, always helping those in need. A childhood friend tearfully recounted Eleanor's stories of her family's suffering, how she carried their pain like a second skin. She wasn't angry, the friend said. She was haunted. The jury, a mix of Willow Creek locals and outsiders, listened intently, their faces a mask of conflicting emotions. For some, Eleanor's actions were unforgivable, a betrayal of trust that had shattered a family and a town. For others, her story stirred unease, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truths of their community's history. The Hawthornes, after all, had not been saints. Rumors surfaced during the trial, old stories of land deals that displaced black families, of workers underpaid and dismissed. One elderly resident, called as a character witness, spoke of a great-uncle who had worked for the Hawthornes' grandparents and never returned home, his fate a mystery. These whispers, though inadmissible as evidence, hung heavy in the air. Eleanor herself remained an enigma. She spoke little during the trial, her responses brief and cryptic. When asked why she targeted the Hawthornes, she said only, "They lived on stolen ground." Her words sent a chill through the courtroom, not for their malice, but for their conviction. Whitaker argued that Eleanor's mental state rendered her incapable of full responsibility, pushing for a verdict of manslaughter rather than murder. Hargrove, however, insisted on first-degree murder, emphasizing the months of planning and the absence of remorse. "She didn't just kill them," he told the jury. "She made them eat their own history." As the trial's first week drew to a close, the town outside the courthouse buzzed with debate. Vigils for the Hawthornes continued, but so did quiet gatherings in homes and churches, where some questioned whether justice could ever be simple in a place built on such a fractured past. Eleanor, sitting silently in her cell each night, clutched a small charm, a gift from her grandmother, whispering words no one could hear. The trial was far from over, and the truth, like the poison she had used, remained elusive, waiting to surface in ways no one could predict. As the second week of Eleanor Grayson's trial began in June 1992, the Willow Creek Courthouse remained a crucible of tension, its wooden benches packed with locals, reporters, and curious onlookers, drawn by the case's unsettling blend of history and horror. The air was thick with anticipation, as each day peeled back another layer of Eleanor's enigmatic psyche. The prosecution, led by Daniel Hargrove, doubled down on their portrayal of her as a methodical killer, wielding her knowledge of plants and her family's past like weapons. The defense, under Sarah Whitaker's steady hand, leaned deeper into Eleanor's mental state, arguing that her actions were the product of a mind fractured by trauma, not malice. The jury, caught between these narratives, faced a question that grew more complex with every testimony. Was Eleanor a mastermind or a victim of her own broken mind? The week's focus turned to Eleanor's psychological evaluation, with Dr. Evelyn Carter returning to the stand. Armed with weeks of interviews conducted in the county jail, Carter presented a detailed portrait of Eleanor's mental landscape. She described a woman whose life had been shaped by an inherited pain, passed down through generations like an heirloom of sorrow. Eleanor's fixation on her ancestors' suffering wasn't just a belief, Carter testified, her voice steady. It was a lens through which she saw the world. She spoke of hearing voices, not auditory hallucinations but memories so vivid they felt alive. Carter recounted Eleanor's descriptions of dreams where her great-grandmother, Bessie, appeared, her hands stained with the soil of the hawthorn plantation, urging Eleanor to make them see. These visions, Carter argued, pointed to a dissociative disorder, where Eleanor's sense of self had merged with a collective grief, blurring the boundaries between past and present. The prosecution challenged Carter's findings, calling their own expert Dr. Leonard Price, a forensic psychiatrist known for his skepticism of trauma-based defenses. Price argued that Eleanor's actions showed too much planning to be the result of mental instability. Her notebook demonstrates clear intent, he said, pointing to entries that outlined the gala's menu, alongside cryptic phrases like, "The roots will choke them." He suggested Eleanor suffered from a personality disorder, perhaps narcissistic or antisocial, that allowed her to justify her actions as righteous. She wasn't delusional, Price insisted. She was vengeful, using her family's history as an excuse for murder. The clash between Carter and Price left the jury grappling with competing images. A woman driven by ancestral ghosts, or a calculating killer hiding behind them. Testimonies from Eleanor's past added fuel to the debate. A former employer, who had hired Eleanor as a cook in the 1980s, described her as meticulous but distant, with a tendency to withdraw into silence during stressful times. She'd stare out the window for hours, he recalled, like she was somewhere else. A childhood teacher spoke of Eleanor's intelligence but noted her obsession with history, even as a girl, often writing essays about the plantation era that were almost too vivid. These accounts painted a picture of a woman who had always carried a heavy burden, her mind a repository for stories no child should have to bear. Yet the prosecution twisted these anecdotes, suggesting Eleanor had nurtured a grudge from a young age, her quiet nature a mask for brewing resentment. The courtroom's attention shifted when Whitaker introduced a surprising witness, Esther Monroe, a distant cousin of Eleanor's who had grown up hearing the same family stories. Esther, now in her 60s, spoke haltingly of their shared heritage, describing how their grandmother had taught them about the old ways, herbal remedies, spiritual rituals, and tales of resistance from their enslaved ancestors. It wasn't just stories, Esther said, her voice trembling. It was a way to survive, to hold on to who we were. She admitted that Eleanor had grown more withdrawn in recent years, especially after visiting the Hawthorne estate for the first time. She said the land spoke to her, Esther whispered, prompting murmurs in the courtroom. Hargrove's cross-examination was relentless, pressing Esther on whether Eleanor had ever spoken of harming the Hawthorns. Esther shook her head, tears falling. She just wanted them to know our pain. Physical evidence continued to mount against Eleanor. Forensic analysis of her cottage revealed traces of the same toxins found in the Hawthorns' bodies, hidden in jars labeled as spices. A search of her garden uncovered plants that matched the toxicological profile, their roots carefully tended, as if Eleanor had been cultivating them for years. The notebook, now infamous, contained a chilling entry from the night before the gala. "Tomorrow the table is set. The ancestors will feast." Hargrove read this aloud, his voice booming, framing it as proof of intent. Whitaker countered that the notebook was a diary of pain, not a blueprint for murder, its language symbolic of Eleanor's inner turmoil. Outside the courthouse, Willow Creek's divisions deepened. Protests formed, some demanding justice for the Hawthorns, others calling for understanding of Eleanor's pain. A local historian published an editorial tracing the Hawthorne family's wealth to the plantation era, igniting debates about reparations and accountability. The trial had become more than a legal battle. It was a reckoning with the town's past. forcing residents to confront truths they'd long ignored. Eleanor, sitting silently through it all, seemed almost detached, her eyes fixed on the courtroom's wooden paneling, as if seeing something no one else could. As the week ended, a new piece of evidence surfaced, shifting the trial's trajectory. A deputy found a letter tucked inside a book in Eleanor's cottage, written in her hand but never sent. Addressed to the descendants of the land, it spoke of a sacrifice, of a balance restored. The meal was their mirror, it read, to show them what they've taken. The letter, vague yet haunting, became the prosecution's trump card, but Whitaker saw it as a cry from a fractured mind. The jury, now burdened with this new revelation, retired for the weekend, their faces heavy with the weight of deciding Eleanor's fate and the town's. The third week of Eleanor Grayson's trial in July 1992 brought Willow Creek to a boiling point, with the courthouse steps crowded by protesters on both sides, some holding signs demanding justice for the Hawthorns, others advocating for empathy toward Eleanor's tormented past. The summer heat amplified the tension, mirroring the emotional firestorm inside the courtroom where the case hurtled toward its climax. Prosecutor Daniel Hargrove, sensing the jury's wavering sympathies, shifted tactics to humanize the victims, calling survivors and friends to recount the Hawthorns' lives. Margaret's sister tearfully described her as a devoted mother and community volunteer, while William's business partner spoke of his generosity. Clara and Thomas, remembered as vibrant young adults with futures ahead, were portrayed through photos and anecdotes, their absence a palpable void that Hargrove used to underscore the irreparable loss caused by Eleanor's actions. Defense attorney Sarah Whitaker countered by delving deeper into the psychological underpinnings of Eleanor's behavior, introducing additional experts to bolster the trauma narrative. A historian specializing in African American genealogy took the stand, tracing Eleanor's lineage back to the Hawthorne plantation with meticulous detail. Using old records and oral histories, he illustrated how Bessie, Eleanor's great-grandmother, had endured unimaginable hardships, her role as a cook a position of both intimacy and exploitation. "These stories don't die," the historian said, his voice resonating through the quiet courtroom. "They echo through families, shaping identities in ways we can't always see." Whitaker connected this to Eleanor's mindset, arguing that her actions were a manifestation of unresolved generational wounds, not a rational choice. The prosecution fired back with a surprise witness, a former acquaintance of Eleanor's from a herbalist group she had joined in the late 1980s. The woman testified that Eleanor had once discussed the power of plants to right wrongs, her words carrying an undercurrent of bitterness. She believed in natural justice, the witness recalled, prompting Hargrove to suggest Eleanor had long harbored vengeful thoughts, using her knowledge not for healing but for harm. Cross-examination revealed the witness's own biases, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Whitaker fought to discredit her, pointing out inconsistencies in her memory, yet the jury's expressions showed the impact. Eleanor's image shifting from haunted victim to potential manipulator. Closing arguments crystallized the divide. Hargrove stood before the jury, his tone grave and insistent. "Eleanor Grayson didn't just serve a meal, she served death wrapped in the guise of history," he declared, urging them to see beyond sympathy to the calculated nature of her plan. Mental anguish doesn't excuse murder. It explains it, but it doesn't absolve it. Whitaker, in her rebuttal, appealed to compassion. "Eleanor's mind was a prison built by centuries of injustice," she said softly, her eyes meeting each juror's. "She didn't choose this path. It was carved for her by a past we all share responsibility for ignoring." The courtroom fell silent as she concluded, the weight of her words hanging like a fog. Deliberations began amid a town on edge. Outside, media vans lined the streets, reporters interviewing residents whose opinions varied wildly. Some viewed the trial as a wake-up call to address historical inequities, leading to impromptu town hall meetings where long-buried stories surfaced. Others decried it as an excuse for crime, fearing it set a dangerous precedent. In the jury room, hours stretched into days, the 12 members, a diverse group reflecting Willow Creek's demographics, debating fiercely. Notes to the judge requested clarifications on mental health laws, hinting at their struggle to balance empathy with accountability. Eleanor, confined to her cell during this time, maintained her stoic facade, but guards noted subtle changes. She spent hours sketching in a provided notebook, images of gardens and shadowy figures that mirrored her original entries. Dr. Evelyn Carter visited once more, finding Eleanor reflective. "It's done," Eleanor told her, a faint smile on her lips. "The land is quiet now." Carter interpreted this as a sign of detachment, perhaps a coping mechanism, but it added another layer to the enigma of her mind. The psychiatrist's final report, submitted post-trial, would later influence discussions on trauma in legal contexts, but for now, it remained sealed. After 3 grueling days, the jury returned with a verdict that stunned the courtroom. "Guilty of manslaughter, not murder." Gasps echoed as the foreman read the words, a compromise that acknowledged Eleanor's intent, but tempered it with her psychological state. Hargrove's face tightened in disappointment, while Whitaker allowed a brief nod of relief. Eleanor showed no reaction, her eyes distant as if the outcome was merely a footnote in a larger story. Sentencing was set for the following week, with possibilities ranging from prison time to psychiatric commitment. Willow Creek, divided yet somehow united in its exhaustion, began to process the decision, whispers turning to conversations about healing and history. The verdict's shadow loomed large not just over Eleanor but over the town itself. It forced a reckoning with the invisible threads connecting past sins to present actions, leaving residents to wonder if true justice could ever be served in a place where memories refused to fade. As the courthouse emptied, the summer sun dipped low, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch back through time, hinting at revelations yet to come. The air in the Willow Creek Courthouse was stifling on the morning of July 20, 1992, as the town gathered for Eleanor Grayson's sentencing. The manslaughter verdict had left a fractured community, with some residents feeling justice had been served, while others believed it was too lenient for the loss of the Hawthorne family. The courtroom, packed beyond capacity, buzzed with a tense anticipation that felt almost tangible, like a storm about to break. Eleanor sat at the defense table, her hands clasped, her face an unreadable mask. Her eyes, once described as warm, now seemed to hold a quiet defiance, as if she were looking through the walls of the courthouse to a place only she could see. The judge, a stern figure named Margaret Ellison, surveyed the room, her gavel poised to bring order to a case that had unraveled the town's sense of itself. The sentencing hearing began with statements from the victims' loved ones. Margaret Hawthorne's sister Ellen took the stand first, her voice trembling as she spoke of the family's warmth and generosity. "They trusted her," she said, glancing at Eleanor. "We all did, and she took them from us." Thomas's college roommate followed, his words choked with grief as he described a young man full of ambition, cut down before his life truly began. Clara's best friend, sobbing, recounted their plans to travel together, dreams now buried with her. Each statement was a knife, sharpening the pain of loss and fueling the prosecution's call for a harsh sentence. Daniel Hargrove stood, urging the judge for the maximum penalty, 20 years, arguing that Eleanor's premeditation outweighed any claims of mental fragility. Sarah Whitaker for the defense took a softer approach, emphasizing rehabilitation over punishment. She called Dr. Evelyn Carter back to the stand, who spoke of Eleanor's potential for recovery with proper psychiatric care. "Incarceration alone won't address the root of her actions," Carter said. "Eleanor's trauma needs treatment, not isolation." Whitaker then made a bold move, requesting that Eleanor be allowed to speak. The courtroom held its breath as Eleanor rose, her movement slow but deliberate. Her voice when she spoke was steady, carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs. "I didn't mean to harm the town," she said, her gaze fixed on the judge. "But the Hawthornes, they stood on ground soaked in my family's blood. I wanted them to feel it, to know it. I'm sorry for the pain, but not for the truth." Her words, devoid of remorse yet heavy with conviction, left the room in stunned silence. Judge Ellison adjourned briefly to consider, the courtroom emptying into a courtyard where arguments erupted among spectators. Some saw Eleanor's statement as a confession of guilt, others as a cry for understanding. Local activists, emboldened by the trial's exposure of historical injustices, distributed pamphlets detailing the Hawthorne plantation's brutal past, urging the town to confront its legacy. Meanwhile, the Hawthorne's supporters gathered near the church, lighting candles in their memory, their grief tinged with anger at what they saw as a miscarriage of justice. The media frenzy intensified, with national outlets framing the case as a clash between personal vengeance and collective history, each headline more sensational than the last. When court reconvened, Judge Ellison delivered the sentence, 7 years in a psychiatric facility, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The decision was a compromise, acknowledging both Eleanor's mental state and the gravity of her actions. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Some felt it too lenient, others too harsh for a woman they saw as broken by history. Eleanor showed no reaction, her eyes fixed on the floor as she was led away in handcuffs. Whitaker, though disappointed, saw the ruling as a chance for Eleanor to heal, while Hargrove, tight-lipped, declined to comment to reporters. The town, already divided, seemed to fracture further, with debates spilling into diners, churches, and living rooms. In the days that followed, Willow Creek struggled to move forward. The Hawthorne estate was put up for sale, its once pristine grounds now avoided by locals who whispered of curses and ghosts. Eleanor's cottage was boarded up, her garden left to wither, though some claimed the plants still grew, defiant in their toxicity. The notebook, now in evidence storage, became a subject of fascination, with scholars requesting access to study its blend of recipes and retribution. Dr. Carter published a preliminary paper on Eleanor's case, arguing it highlighted the need for society to address intergenerational trauma, though her work sparked controversy among those who saw it as excusing a crime. Eleanor, now in a state psychiatric facility, began her treatment under close supervision. Early reports from her doctors noted her compliance, but also her persistent detachment, as if part of her remained tethered to the past. She spent hours sketching, gardens, faces, symbols no one could decipher, her silence a barrier to understanding her true motives. Back in Willow Creek, the trial's aftermath lingered like a bruise, forcing residents to confront questions of guilt, forgiveness, and the shadows cast by history. The case had exposed fault lines, but it also planted seeds of change, with community leaders organizing forums to discuss the town's past and its path forward. As summer faded into autumn, a quiet shift began. A local school added lessons on the plantation era, and a memorial was proposed not just for the Hawthornes but for the enslaved people who had built Willow Creek's wealth. Eleanor's name, once spoken in whispers, became a symbol of a larger reckoning, her story a mirror reflecting truths the town could no longer ignore. Yet, as the leaves fell, one question remained unanswered, lingering like a ghost. What had Eleanor truly seen in her dreams, and what secrets did she still carry? Autumn settled over Willow Creek in 1992, casting a golden haze over the town as it grappled with the aftermath of Eleanor Grayson's trial and sentencing. The once vibrant Hawthorne estate stood abandoned, its gates locked, its windows reflecting the changing seasons like empty eyes. The town, though still raw from the tragedy, began to shift its focus inward, prompted by the trial's exposure of long-buried histories. Eleanor's actions and the questions they raised about justice, trauma, and legacy had ignited a slow-burning transformation in Willow Creek. Yet, even as the community sought to heal, the enigma of Eleanor herself deepened, her silence in the psychiatric facility a puzzle that refused to be solved. The truth, it seemed, was not finished with this town. In the state psychiatric facility, Eleanor adapted to her new reality with an unsettling calm. Her days were structured: therapy sessions, group activities, and supervised time in the facility's garden, where she tended plants with the same care she had once shown her toxic herbs. Her doctors, led by Dr. Evelyn Carter, who continued to consult on her case, noted her compliance but were troubled by her reticence. Eleanor spoke little, answering questions with vague references to the land or the balance. During art therapy, she produced intricate drawings, scenes of fields under starry skies, faces that resembled her ancestors, and a recurring image of a woman stirring a pot, her eyes hollow. "It's Bessie," she told Carter once, her voice soft but certain. "She's still here." Carter's sessions with Eleanor revealed a mind caught in a liminal space, where the present was inseparable from the past. Eleanor described visions that came not just in dreams but in waking moments. Flashes of her great-grandmother standing at the edge of her bed, whispering of debts unpaid. "She didn't tell me to kill," Eleanor clarified during one session, her first direct reference to the crime. "She told me to make them see." Carter interpreted this as a sign of progress, a crack in Eleanor's detachment, but also a challenge. Was Eleanor rationalizing her actions or genuinely unable to distinguish her own will from the voices of her ancestors? The psychiatrist began to suspect a form of dissociative identity disorder, where parts of Eleanor's psyche had fragmented under the weight of historical trauma, but proving it remained elusive. Back in Willow Creek, the town's reckoning continued. The trial had unearthed records of the Hawthorne plantation, prompting a local historical society to launch an investigation into the estate's origins. They uncovered documents detailing land seizures and labor abuses, stories that corroborated the oral histories Eleanor's family had preserved. A community forum held in the town hall drew hundreds where residents, black and white, shared stories of their families' ties to the land. Some spoke of pride in Willow Creek's progress, others of shame for its silences. The forum led to a proposal for a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, a bold step for a small southern town, aimed at acknowledging past wrongs and fostering dialogue. The Hawthorne name, once synonymous with benevolence, now carried a shadow, their legacy tainted by truths no one could ignore. Eleanor's story, meanwhile, took on a life of its own. Her notebook, excerpts of which had leaked to the press, became a subject of fascination for scholars and activists. A university professor in Richmond requested access to study it, arguing it was a rare artifact of intergenerational trauma expressed through folklore and action. The leaked passages, poetic yet chilling, blending recipes with calls for justice, sparked debates in academic circles about the ethics of vengeance and the psychological toll of systemic injustice. A documentary crew arrived in Willow Creek, interviewing residents and retracing Eleanor's steps, their cameras lingering on the overgrown garden behind her cottage. The film, still in production by year's end, promised to frame Eleanor not as a villain or victim, but as a mirror for a nation's unresolved sins. In the facility, Eleanor received occasional visitors, her cousin Esther, who brought news of the town's changes, and Sarah Whitaker, who checked on her progress. Esther, tearful during one visit, told Eleanor about the memorial being planned for the enslaved people of Willow Creek, a project she never expected to see. Eleanor listened, her face softening, but said little. Whitaker, meanwhile, was working on an appeal, arguing that Eleanor's sentence should be reduced in light of her ongoing treatment. The lawyer noticed subtle changes. Eleanor's sketches now included images of the Hawthorne family, their faces not angry but sorrowful, as if she were processing her actions in a new light. "Do you regret it?" Whitaker asked once. Eleanor paused, then said, "I regret the pain." But the truth had to come out. By December, Willow Creek was preparing for its first winter since the tragedy. The town quieter but not unchanged. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee had begun its work, hosting workshops and collecting stories, while the Hawthorne estate remained unsold, its future uncertain. Eleanor's case had left a mark, not just on the town but on broader discussions about mental health and historical accountability. Dr. Carter presented her findings at a national conference, arguing that Eleanor's story highlighted the need for systemic approaches to trauma, sparking interest among policymakers. Yet for all the progress, questions lingered. What had driven Eleanor to that final fatal act? Was it madness, vengeance, or something deeper? A call from a past that refused to stay buried? As the year drew to a close, Eleanor sat in the facility's garden, her hands in the soil, planting seeds for spring. A guard watching her noted a faint hum, a melody she sang under her breath, one that seemed to echo the rhythms of her ancestors. The truth, whatever it was, remained locked within her, a secret as potent as the herbs she once wielded. Willow Creek, forever changed, stood at a crossroads, its future shaped by the courage to face what Eleanor had forced into the light. As the winter of 1992 cloaked Willow Creek in a quiet frost, the story of Eleanor Grayson settled into the town's bones, a haunting reminder of truths too long buried. The Hawthorne estate, its windows dark and its gardens overgrown, stood as a monument to a tragedy that had reshaped a community. Eleanor, confined to a psychiatric facility, remained an enigma, a woman whose actions had forced a town to confront its past, yet whose inner world remained just out of reach. Her story, rooted in the pain of her ancestors and the fragility of her mind, had become a mirror for Willow Creek, reflecting both its wounds and its capacity for change. You, dear viewer, have journeyed through this tale, from the chilling night of the gala to the courtroom's tense verdict, and now stand at the edge of its conclusion. You've dared to peer into the darkness of the human psyche, where history and madness intertwine, and for that you are part of a rare and fearless group. This story, drawn from the shadows of the American Monsters series, is more than a crime. It's a window into the cost of silence, the weight of unacknowledged pain. Eleanor Grayson didn't just serve a meal, She served a reckoning, forcing a town to face the sins embedded in its soil. Her actions, born from a mind fractured by centuries of injustice, raise questions that linger like ghosts. What happens when a wound festers across generations? Can justice ever be clean when it's born from such pain? And how do we, as a society, heal when the past refuses to stay buried? These are the questions that mark you as a seeker of truth, someone unafraid to confront the unsettling realities that lurk beneath the surface of our world. Eleanor's notebook, now locked away in evidence, remains a testament to her story, a blend of recipes and retribution, a cry from a woman who felt the weight of her ancestors' suffering as her own. Her sketches, her whispered prayers, her quiet defiance in the face of judgment, they all point to a truth that transcends the courtroom. Willow Creek, in the wake of her trial, has begun to change. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee, sparked by her case, meets monthly, collecting stories from descendants of the enslaved and the enslavers alike, weaving a tapestry of acknowledgement that might one day mend the town's fractures. The proposed memorial for the plantation's forgotten workers is taking shape, a small but vital step toward healing. Yet Eleanor's silence in the facility, her hand still tending to plants as if communing with the earth, suggests that some truths may never be fully spoken. What does this mean for us, for you, who have followed this journey to its end? It means you've seen the human mind at its most fragile and its most fierce, a place where pain can become purpose, where history can drive a soul to acts both terrible and profound. Eleanor's story challenges us to look at our own lives, our own communities, and ask, what histories do we ignore? What debts remain unpaid? Her meal was a mirror, held up not just to the Hawthorns but to all of us, urging us to see the shadows we'd rather avoid. You've stayed until the end, and that makes you part of a community that dares to ask these questions, to seek the truths that others turn away from. Now let's make that connection deeper. In the comments below, share your thoughts with the phrase, "This story changed my way of seeing the human mind." By doing so, you're not just sharing an opinion, you're declaring yourself part of a group that seeks to understand the inexplicable, to shine a light on the dark corners of our world. Your words will resonate with others, building a community of truth seekers who refuse to let these stories fade into silence. And please, share this video with someone you know, so they too can confront the chilling reality of Eleanor's tale. Every share is a spark, spreading awareness of the hidden truths that shape our lives. Imagine a world where stories like Eleanor's remain untold, buried like the roots of her deadly herbs. By subscribing to this channel, you're planting a seed of curiosity, ensuring that these tales of mystery, of pain, of the human psyche pushed to its limits, continue to be explored. You're joining a movement, a collective of minds unafraid to walk the dark paths of the inexplicable, to unravel the secrets that others dare not touch. Your subscription is a vow to keep that curiosity alive, to keep asking questions even when the answers are unsettling. Thank you for being here, for daring to follow Eleanor's story to its haunting end. You've seen the fragility of morality, the unpredictability of a mind shaped by history, and the vulnerability we all share in the face of the past's long reach. Keep watching, keep questioning, and keep seeking the truths that lie hidden in the shadows. The next story is waiting, and it's just as unsettling, just as profound. Will you be there to uncover it?